A window on the Long Island coast, open to the sea. An 87-year-old woman is dying in it, quietly, without an audience. No palace. No crowd, no footman at the door. 69 years earlier, 300 police officers couldn't hold back the crowd trying to see her get married. She was 18. Her family owned more money than some governments. And behind her wedding veil, in front of 600 guests, she was crying. This is what happened in between. How does the richest, most photographed bride in America end up weeping her way down the aisle of her own wedding? Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt. Before this ends, you'll know what a steel rod strapped to a 10-year-old's spine was actually for. You'll know what a rival for her husband's affection did to her own face with paraffin wax, chasing a man Consuelo no longer wanted. And you'll hear what a Vanderbilt, under oath, decades later, finally admitted to a Vatican investigator about how that wedding really happened. This isn't a story about money. Money is just the mechanism. This is a story about who gets to make the decisions in a life and how long it can take to get that right back. There's a staircase in this story. A child climbs it alone, in the dark, whispering one word to herself. Hold on to that. It comes back at the very end, and it will mean something different by then. Stay with it. New York City, the 2nd of March, 1877. The Vanderbilts, railroads, shipping, a fortune so large it had its own gravitational pull, had just gotten a daughter. Her mother named her after a friend who had already pulled off the exact move Alva Vanderbilt intended to pull off herself, trading American dollars for a European title. The name wasn't sentiment, it was a business plan with a bow on it. Alva ran that plan like an engineer. No games, no unstructured afternoons, no ordinary childhood. Tutors in 3 languages by age 8. A weekly recital her mother graded like an exam. And at 10 years old, a steel rod fitted down her daughter's spine, strapped at the waist and shoulders, so that even sitting to read became an exercise in enduring pain. When Consuelo once objected to an outfit chosen for her, her mother's answer became the sentence that ran her adolescence. I do the thinking. You do as you are told. Slouch, raise your voice, have an opinion. The riding crop answered all 3. What Alva couldn't reach was the inside of her daughter's head. Consuelo read obsessively, history, poetry, women who had suffered for something and survived it anyway. And at night, alone, she climbed the family's grand staircase toward bed, the gaslights dimming behind her, whispering the same word into the dark, over and over, courage. Remember that staircase. By her mid-teens, dressmakers in Paris were recording her waist to the inch. Newspapers would eventually print the measurements of her hands and feet, like livestock catalogued for auction. Her mother called her ready, not raised. Assembled, she had no idea what ready was about to cost her. At 17, on a European tour her mother had designed specifically to produce a title, Consuelo did something nobody had accounted for. She fell in love on her own. His name was Winthrop Rutherfurd, old New York money, descended from Peter Stuyvesant, and completely uninterested in anything but Consuelo herself. During a bicycle outing, away from the chaperones for a few unsupervised minutes, he proposed. She said yes. It was the first decision of her entire life that belonged to nobody but her. It lasted less than a season. Alva intercepted the letters, forbade the match outright. When Consuelo planned to elope anyway, her mother locked her in her room and reportedly threatened to have Rutherfurd killed rather than let the marriage happen. Consuelo believed her. Then came the performance that finally broke her. Alva took to her bed, stopped eating, and told her daughter that this defiance was going to kill her. Day after day, Consuelo watched her mother waste away, and finally, at 17, she sent word that the engagement was over. Alva recovered almost immediately. With Rutherfurd gone, Alva produced her replacement, Charles Spencer-Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, nicknamed Sonny, a name that fit almost nothing about him. He held the title to Blenheim Palace and debts he had no way of paying. What he didn't hold was any particular interest in the 19-year-old he was about to marry. He proposed in the Gothic room at Marble House, the Vanderbilt summer estate, a room built to look like a cathedral, which made it in hindsight an almost too perfect setting for a transaction dressed as a sacrament. Consuelo said yes, not out of hope, out of having nothing left to refuse with. The 6th of November, 1895. St. Thomas Church, 5th Avenue. 300 police officers straining to hold a crowd that had been gathering since dawn. Inside, roughly 600 of the wealthiest people in America waited in the pews. The settlement, $2.5 million in railroad stock, worth well over $90 million today, had already been negotiated down to the last clause. The bride was 20 minutes late, not because of nerves, because she could not stop crying long enough to leave the house. When she finally appeared at the church door, the swelling around her eyes was visible even through the veil. Her father walked her down the aisle in silence. There was nothing left for him to say. He was giving his daughter to a man she didn't love, in a wedding orchestrated by a woman he'd already divorced. Newspapers the next morning called it the marriage of the century. One editorial cartoon showed her at the altar in chains, shackled to her mother. Nobody in that crowd asked whether she was happy. Nobody had thought to. She was now the Duchess of Marlborough. She had not married a man. She'd been signed over to a dynasty. The confession came on the honeymoon. Somewhere between Paris and the crossing to England, the Duke of Marlborough told his 19-year-old bride calmly, without cruelty, as though reporting the weather, that he had given up the woman he actually loved to marry her, and that he intended to feel nothing for her going forward. He had married her, he explained, for one reason only, to save Blenheim Palace. She was the funding mechanism, the house was the point. And the house needed saving badly. Built 2 centuries earlier as a royal gift for a military victory, Blenheim had been slowly gutted by generations of Marlboroughs who spent more than the estate could ever produce. By the time Consuelo arrived, the family had already sold off paintings, furniture, an 18,000-volume library, anything not nailed to the floor, just to keep from going under completely. Her dowry rebuilt it. New jewels, new furnishings, restored gardens, an expanded staff, an entire estate resurrected on Vanderbilt money, while the woman financing all of it was informed, plainly, that she would never be loved inside it. The Duke's own grandmother made the terms of her arrival even clearer within days. Her first duty, she was told, was to produce a son, because it would be intolerable. In the old woman's words, for the Duke's cousin to inherit the title instead. That cousin's name was Winston Churchill. Consuelo understood the assignment. She gave the family an heir in 1897 and a second son the following year. Her job, as she'd later describe it with unmistakable bitterness, was now complete. What nobody at Blenheim discussed with her, because none of them needed to, was that her husband had a separate, private life running entirely alongside the marriage. The staff saw it. She simply wasn't told the details. She was expected to live around them. By 1900, the marriage had settled into something closer to a shared address than a partnership. Dinners in silence. Appearances managed like diplomatic protocol. A husband and wife who had, for all practical purposes, already separated years before anyone made it official. But something else was happening at the same time, quietly, almost without Consuelo noticing it herself. She started walking the tenant lanes on the Blenheim estate, cottages with no plumbing, children working instead of attending school. Medical care nobody had ever bothered to provide. Nobody asked her to do this. It wasn't in the curriculum her mother had built. She went anyway, brought food and medicine instead of cameras, and came back the following week. And the week after that. The tenants, who'd expected another decorative foreign duchess passing through for photographs, got a woman who remembered their children's names. It was the first evidence of something her mother's entire training had never once accounted for. A version of Consuelo who didn't need a title to feel useful. If anything, the title was getting in the way of it. In 1905, the family sat for the society painter John Singer Sargent, the Duke in his ceremonial robes, Consuelo in white satin, two young sons positioned neatly between them. It's one of the most reproduced portraits of the entire Edwardian aristocracy. It is also, according to everyone who actually lived inside that house, a portrait of a marriage that had already finished dying by the time the paint dried. In 1900, Consuelo asked her husband for something almost unheard of, permission to see Winthrop Rutherfurd again, to find out whether the life she'd given up at 17 could still be reclaimed. Remarkably, the Duke said yes. He had no real claim on a wife he'd never wanted in the first place. She went to London. She met Rutherfurd. And in a single conversation, the man who had once proposed to her on a bicycle told her he couldn't go through with it after all. He'd grown too attached to the idea of her to actually risk having her. Rejection, dressed up as devotion. It landed exactly as hard the second time. The Duke, for his part, left almost immediately for southern Africa, joining his cousin Winston Churchill in the Boer War. He was gone 6 months. Whether it was grief, humiliation, or simple restlessness, nobody ever fully explained. Least of all him. When he came home that July, Consuelo met him with a confession of her own. An affair, deliberately unsubtle, with his own cousin, Reginald Fellows. It wasn't passion, it was retaliation, delivered without raising her voice. By the time it was over, husband and wife had, in every meaningful sense, already ended the marriage, 6 years before either of them said so out loud. The public scandal, when it finally arrived, didn't come from Consuelo at all. It came from a 14-year-old girl in Paris who had already decided, years before anyone else was paying attention, exactly who she wanted to marry. Her name was Gladys Deacon. Paris-born, ferociously intelligent, celebrated across Europe as one of the great beauties of her generation. Marcel Proust once wrote that he'd never encountered a woman of such beauty, intelligence, and charm in one person. At 14, hearing about Consuelo's engagement, Gladys wrote to her own mother complaining that she was still too young to catch him yet. She got her chance. She became a fixture at Blenheim, close to both the Duke and Consuelo. And sometime around the year of the Marlboroughs' formal separation, the friendship with the Duke became an affair. It ran, on and off, for roughly 15 years. What London gossiped about was the affair itself. What nobody outside a small circle knew was what the ambition underneath it had already cost Gladys personally. At 22, terrified her looks wouldn't last long enough to land the marriage she wanted, she had paraffin wax injected into the bridge of her nose in Paris, chasing a permanent, classical profile. The wax didn't hold. Over the following years it slipped downward, thickening her jawline, altering a face that had once stopped conversations across a room. She finally married the Duke in 1921, 40 years old, a 14-year ambition finally realized. It lasted barely a decade. He evicted her from Blenheim in 1933. She spent her last 15 years in the psychiatric ward of a hospital and asked, before she died, that her once famous blue-green eyes be painted onto her own gravestone. The only version of that beauty she could still control. Consuelo absorbed the public embarrassment of the affair with something closer to relief than heartbreak. By then, the marriage had already taken everything from her it was ever going to take. The formal separation came in 1906, after 11 years of marriage. No scene, no confrontation for the servants to whisper about, just a quiet, negotiated end to two lives that had been sharing an address for years. Consuelo moved into Sunderland House, the London mansion her father had built her, one of the only freehold properties in a city where the aristocracy almost exclusively leased. And she used the freedom immediately. Her Friday evenings there became something closer to a salon than a society event, writers, reformers, suffragists gathering without place cards or predetermined seating. George Bernard Shaw came. So did the young leaders of Britain's growing suffrage movement, a cause her own mother, back in America, had by now thrown herself into with the exact ferocity she'd once reserved for arranging her daughter's marriage. But Consuelo went further than her mother had. She sat on Britain's National Commission on the declining birth rate. The only woman without a medical or clerical title, at a table otherwise filled with doctors and clergy, and when she spoke in specifics: overcrowded tenements, malnourished infants, mothers with no access to a doctor. The reformer Marie Stopes reportedly told the room afterward that Consuelo was the only person present speaking from lived experience rather than theory. By 1907, London newspapers had a nickname for her that started as faint mockery and slowly became simple fact: the working duchess. In 1913, she organized a conference at Sunderland House that put working women themselves in front of an audience of bishops and industrialists, describing in their own words what it cost to earn a living making shirts in London's East End. Within a week, several trades had secured new legal protections. Quiet, not a headline, just effective. His name was Jacques Balsan, and by the time he finally married Consuelo, he'd already loved her for close to a quarter of a century. Balsan was a French aviation pioneer, one of the country's earliest licensed pilots. A former balloonist who had once drifted off course from France into Prussia and crash-landed on a baron's estate. A war veteran who'd flown reconnaissance during the First World War and helped establish the Volunteer Air Squadron that became a precursor to the American Air Force. He was also, by every account, almost universally liked, generous, unpretentious. Entirely without the performed self-importance that had defined Consuelo's first husband. He'd first met her when she was still a teenager, a guest at Blenheim during the early misery of her first marriage, and had fallen for her almost immediately. Unlike Rutherfurd, unlike the Duke, he never once treated her like a transaction. He simply waited. The wait lasted decades longer than it should have, for reasons that had nothing to do with either of them. Balsan was Catholic. Consuelo's first marriage had ended only in civil divorce, which the church didn't recognize. Without a formal annulment, his own devout family couldn't fully receive her, and Consuelo, remarkably, asked him not to break with them over it. She'd wait for the resolution rather than force it. That resolution arrived in 1926, when the Duke, remarried to Gladys, converting fully to Catholicism himself, petitioned Rome for an annulment of a marriage that had made global headlines more than 3 decades earlier. The annulment required proof of coercion, and the person who ultimately supplied it was the same woman who had done the coercing. Alva Belmont, 73 years old by then, a celebrated leader of the American suffrage movement, a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades fighting for other women's right to choose their own lives, sat before a Vatican investigator and said, "Without qualification, I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter." The annulment was granted on the 19th of August, 1926. In the eyes of the Church, The marriage that had defined half of Consuelo's life had officially never happened. The marriage left two boys behind, and it marked each of them differently. John, born in 1897, carried the courtesy title Marquess of Blandford, the heir the entire union had existed to produce. His birth was met with bells rung across the villages around Blenheim and champagne poured for the staff, while his mother, still recovering from labour, was told a nurse would take over his care immediately. A duchess, she was informed, must not risk spoiling an heir with too much affection. He inherited the dukedom in 1934 and spent his life running the palace his mother's fortune had rescued. Ivor arrived the following year to considerably less fanfare and, in an odd reversal, considerably more of his mother's genuine attention, since the household no longer needed to protect the fiction of an heir's importance around a second son. Consuelo later wrote that with Ivor she was allowed something closer to real motherhood. Persistent rumors within the family, voiced most pointedly, years later, by Gladys Deacon herself, suggested his biological father might actually have been Winthrop Rutherfurd. The claim was never proven. Consuelo never addressed it publicly. What both boys inherited, in different ways, was the same pattern that had shaped their mother's own childhood, a family in which titles and dynastic obligation consistently outranked ordinary affection. Consuelo had been raised by a mother whose love came with conditions attached. Her sons were raised, in turn, inside a system that had shaped their own parents the exact same way. And the cousin their birth had displaced, the one their grandmother had called intolerable as a possible heir, never stopped visiting. Winston Churchill remained close to both of Consuelo's sons for the rest of his life, forever tied to a marriage that had, quite literally, redirected the entire course of his political career. By the 1930s, the world that had produced Consuelo Vanderbilt was dissolving faster than any single family's fortune could hold back. Her mother spent her final years slower and quieter than the force of nature who'd once terrorized a daughter into obedience and reshaped New York society by sheer will. At her villa outside Paris, eyesight failing, Alva and Consuelo now sat together in a silence that had nothing punitive left in it, two women who'd fought a war neither had chosen, keeping each other company at its end. Alva died in her sleep on the 26th of January, 1933, at 80. The funeral was modest, no suffrage banners, no headline calling her villain or hero. Just a name, a date, and a silence Consuelo would later describe as the collapse of the scaffolding her whole life had been built on. The France she and Jacques had settled into was, by then, heading toward its own collapse. When German forces advanced on Paris, they joined the roads clogged with refugees, their car packed with only what mattered, and crossed the Atlantic back to a brother's quiet countryside home, not the marble mansions of her childhood, most of which no longer existed in any form she'd recognize. What she kept, through every loss, was the same instinct that had first sent her down muddy tenant lanes at Blenheim 3 decades earlier. During the war, she organized relief work without fanfare, sending parcels and funds to French families and the wounded. "What I do is small," she said once, "but so is bread, and it still feeds the hungry." She'd lost her mother, her adopted country, and most of the world she'd been born into. What she never lost was the capacity to be useful. By this point in her life, that mattered to her considerably more than any title ever had. The years after the war brought Consuelo and Jacques back to Paris, to a home along the Champ de Mars, where the Eiffel Tower stood visible from the windows and the Seine moved past at the same unhurried pace it always had. Mornings with books, afternoons with visitors, evenings by the fire. In 1950, she was named honorary president of a hospital she'd helped fund years earlier, and received France's Legion of Honor in a ceremony so understated that the presenter simply handed the medal to Jacques and asked him to pin it on his wife himself. 3 years later, she published her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold. A title that was itself the whole verdict: the glitter of a marriage built to rescue a house, and the gold of a second one built on nothing but choice. Then, in quick succession, the losses that close out every long life arrived. In 1956, Jacques, 88 years old, the man who had waited nearly 3 decades for her, died. Consuelo left Paris for the English coast. Then eventually settled on Long Island, in Southampton, New York, closer to where her story had started than she may have originally planned. She spent her final years there, answering letters in the morning, reading in the afternoon, surrounded now by grandchildren instead of footmen. In December of 1964, pneumonia took her gently, in a room she'd chosen herself, beside a window facing the sea. She was 87. Her burial instructions surprised almost no one who had truly understood her by then. Not the Vanderbilt vault on Staten Island, not a mausoleum matching the fortune she'd been born into. She asked to be buried at St. Martin's Church in Bladon, Oxfordshire, a small parish churchyard in sight of Blenheim Palace, beside her younger son Ivor, who had died of a brain tumour that same year, just months before Jacques. The palace rebuilt with her dowry, the marriage that had cost her the man she'd actually loved, the title that had defined the first quarter-century of her adult life. She chose, in the end, to rest within sight of all of it anyway, not because it had ever claimed her, but because, by then, it no longer could. Consuelo's estate at her death was valued at roughly $1 million, modest against the fortune she'd been born into, because the bulk of the original Vanderbilt trusts had already passed directly to her sons and grandchildren decades earlier. Most of her remaining personal property went to her eldest granddaughter, Lady Sarah Russell. Her elder son received nothing further. The will noted, plainly, that ample provision had already been made for him. Blenheim Palace survives today, open to paying visitors, its gardens still drawing tourists beneath the same Sargent portrait that once hung as a monument to a marriage already dying by the time the paint dried. Gladys Deacon, who'd waited 14 years for a marriage that lasted barely a decade, spent her final 15 years in a psychiatric ward, largely forgotten. And Alva's legacy split into 2 halves historians still argue over: the mother who whipped a daughter into a marriage she never wanted, and the suffragist who left $100,000 to the National Women's Party, whose Washington headquarters, bought with Alva's own money, still stands today as a national monument to women's equality. Decades after the wedding made headlines on 2 continents, private correspondence between William K. Vanderbilt and the Marlborough family surfaced in a New York court proceeding, laying out, in cold financial language, exactly what each side had expected from the other before the wedding ever took place. It confirmed in writing what society had only ever whispered. By the time Consuelo died in 1964, the labels that had followed her for most of a century, dollar princess, reluctant bride, working duchess, had all outlived their usefulness. What was left was harder to summarize and considerably harder to buy. A woman who had, eventually, built a life on terms nobody else had approved in advance. For decades, the popular version of this story flattened into a single, tidy shape: poor little rich girl, sold for a title, eventually freed. Satisfying headline. Incomplete story. What the actual record shows, her memoir, the surviving letters, the Vatican testimony, the court filings that surfaced decades later, is more complicated than victimhood alone. Consuelo wasn't simply an ornament moved from one household to the next. By multiple contemporary accounts, she was one of the more effective reform-minded figures of her era, sitting on national commissions, organizing labor conferences that produced real legislative protections, winning elected office in her own right on the London County Council, and holding that seat through 2 elections. What she was not, despite decades of tabloid shorthand, was merely tragic. What emerges instead is a woman who spent her first 2 decades having every major decision made for her, and then spent the next 6 systematically reclaiming that authority, one commission, one election, one relationship of her own choosing, at a time. The most quietly devastating detail in the entire record isn't the steel rod, or the honeymoon confession, or even the affair with Gladys Deacon. It's Alva's testimony before that Vatican investigator. A woman who'd spent nearly 20 years fighting for other women's right to self-determination, forced to admit under oath that she'd denied that same right to her own daughter. It isn't a villain's confession. It's harder to categorize than that, a reformer confronting, decades too late, the one injustice her own politics had never quite reached. What the newspapers of 1895 called a fairy tale was, in fact, a coerced transaction dressed in orange blossoms shipped from Blenheim's own greenhouses. What later tellings sometimes reduced to pure tragedy was, in fact, a longer and more active story, one where the woman at its center eventually stopped being the subject of other people's decisions and became the author of her own. Go back to it now. A 10-year-old girl in a New York mansion, a steel rod fastened to her spine, climbing alone toward bed while the gaslights dim behind her. One word, whispered into the dark, over and over, like a prayer with nobody listening: courage. Not courage to survive the house, courage to eventually leave it, not just the building, but the entire fate waiting at the end of that hallway. It took most of a lifetime, a rejected elopement, a wedding she cried through, a honeymoon confession delivered without cruelty and without love, 25 years inside a house built to outlast affection, a rival's ruined face, a mother's belated confession before a Vatican investigator, and finally, at 44, a marriage to a man who had simply waited for her to be free. How does the most eligible heiress in America end up sobbing behind her wedding veil? Not a twist, an observation. She ends up there because, for the first 17 years of her life, every door that might have led somewhere else was closed by somebody else's hand, for somebody else's legacy. The tragedy was never the wedding. The tragedy was how little say she had in reaching it. That isn't where her story ends, though. She built a hospital. She helped change labor law for women who'd never once been invited to speak for themselves before she gave them the room. She raised 2 sons inside a broken system and still managed, with the younger one, to give a kind of love she'd never once been allowed to receive herself. And at 44, she married for no reason except that she wanted to. The Vanderbilt fortune bought a palace, a title, restored gardens, a full jewel box, a roof over 300 rooms for another century. What it could never buy back, what no fortune has ever managed to purchase for anyone, was the 17 years already spent obeying instead of choosing. She got the gold in the end. She never got those years back.